Welcome to the Clandestine Radio Podcast, Season 2.
Good evening, curious minds out there across the world. You are tuned in to the Clandestine Radio Podcast. As always, I'm your host, DJ Joswa, and this is Season 2, Episode 6, The Hidden Hand, Part 1, The Real Illuminati. And if you didn't run away at the sight of the title, then, well, thank you first of all, but you probably have at least a small curiosity about this topic and about the people and families and organizations that might possibly, may or may not, lurk in the shadows behind closed doors and control global events on the world stage. Personally, I've gone back and forth and wrestled with this information for about 20 years now, more than that actually. It's a topic that I've always found fascinating. And then I would dig into a little ways and I would find ways to debunk it and prove to myself that no, this is all crazy conspiracy talk and there's no way that any of this stuff is real. And then I would come across something else that tied back into something. But there's such a massive amount of mis and disinformation out there, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a bit, but that it's really been one very lengthy process to try to sort through this and decide whether or not I felt like I could confidently cover this and bring it to you guys in any kind of a meaningful way anyways, other than just looking at some of the crazy David Icke theories and debunking them, or jumping onto something else that somebody said that kind of makes sense. So this is the culmination of all of that writing and researching. And I hope that you enjoy this episode. It's kind of a return to form, back to Season 1 in a lot of ways. I don't feel like anything that we covered in Season 1 was any sort of a conspiracy theory, quote unquote. Everything that I brought you was based on documented evidence and things that I can back up 100%. This, mostly. I feel like I can mostly back quite a bit of this up. I definitely did my absolute best to go through, and if it could be debunked, toss it out completely. If I couldn't debunk it, I left it in, I'll leave it up to you. But I'm going to make that clear throughout this series whenever we come across things like that. In the end, hopefully you'll have a better idea of how this vast network has possibly come together to truly control the world as we know it. At bare minimum, has shaped historical events throughout time and seems to be repeating in a lot of ways. So I hope you find this fascinating. It was pretty fascinating to research. I learned some things that I didn't know just in the process of doing this first episode. So don't want to hold you up much longer, guys. Just want to tell you thanks. I really do appreciate you clicking on this, giving it a chance, and hopefully by the end we'll all learn a little something. Without further ado, let's go ahead and get into it. Now, we can't even begin to get into this massive topic without at least first going back quite a bit. So let's start off with a little prologue called A History of Secrecy and Deceit, Illuminati 101. While the term Illuminati gets thrown around in reference to many things and typically gets used today as kind of an overarching title for the global elite or any number of secret societies said to hold influence over global affairs, The name is much older, and while it has almost become a cliche of truther circles and the punchline of conspiracy jokes, there is actually quite a bit of both very real and provable, as well as long speculated, history behind it. In order to get at the truth of this story, first we have to rewind about 276 years, as we like to do on this show, and cover a little bit of historical background. Born on the 6th of February, 1746, in Ingolstadt, which is located within the electorate of Bavaria, Adam Weishaupt was the son of Johann Georg Weishaupt, a professor of law at the University of Ingolstadt. Little to nothing is known of his mother. I wasn't even able to find her name listed anywhere, and his father would pass away when Adam was only 5, at which point he came under the tutelage of his godfather, another law professor at the school, Adam von Eichstätt, a proponent of the intellectual and philosophical movement of Enlightenment, which favored scientific reasoning and knowledge based in rationalism and empiricism over the long-accepted religious dogma and doctrine of the day. I don't want to gloss over the importance of the Enlightenment movement, as its stark contrast to and undermining of the authority of the monarchs of the day as well as the church itself would go on to birth several revolutions, as well as liberalism, socialism, and neoclassicism, and become a cornerstone of Masonic lodges. All of this would greatly influence young Weishaupt and shape the direction of his life. Weishaupt began his formal schooling at a Jesuit school at age 7 and would go on to graduate university in 1768 at age 20, from the same school his father and his mentor taught at, and with a doctorate of law. In 1772 he converted to Protestantism and would become a law professor himself. In 1773 Pope Clement XIV would begin his suppression of the Society of Jesuits and remove all members of the Jesuits from most of Western Europe. It was at this point that Weishaupt would become a professor of canon law, a position previously reserved exclusively for the Jesuit order. Without getting bogged down any further in what all of that actually means, let's get on to the point of why Adam Weishaupt is so important to tonight's story to begin with. On May 1st of 1776, just 2 months and 3 days before the Declaration of Independence would be ratified by the Second Continental Congress, officially establishing the United States of America, Weishaupt would found the Bavarian Illuminati, or as it was originally known, the Order of Perfectibles. The order was said to be for outstanding and enlightened individuals in society, and even the title was adopted from the Latin root illuminatus, meaning enlightened. Every single encyclopedia, online reference site, and even most of the writings of the time would vary and disagree as to the true goal of the order. Most tend to agree, however, in the fact that it was formed with the vision of liberating mankind from religious bondage and undermining, quote, corrupt governments. The true nature of the group in action involved operating via an elaborate network of spies and counter-spies, with each isolated cell of initiates reporting back to a superior whom they did not know. This technique would live on in other groups and other secret societies. Weishaupt would be initiated into the Masonic Lodge of Munich in 1777, using his Freemason connections to recruit for his own quasi-Masonic society with the stated goal of, quote, perfecting human nature, through re-education to achieve a common state with nature, freed of government and organized religion. Along with Adolf Freiherr Knigge, they would organize the ritual structure and massively expand the secret organization. While enlightenment served as the basis of the order early on, it would soon come to subvert and twist its principles of independence of thought and judgment, and seek to direct its members' beliefs to follow those of the order's superiors. In 1785, writings from the order would be intercepted and shown to be seditious by the government of Bavaria. More on this later. Weishaupt would soon lose his position at the University of Ingolstadt and subsequently flee Bavaria for Gotha, where he would receive the assistance of Duke Ernest II of Saxe-Gotha-Altenburg, which, for the record, is the ancestor for the Saxe-Gotha and Saxe-Coburg bloodlines, which have ruled over Belgium, Portugal, Bulgaria, as well as the UK, and from which former Queen Elizabeth and current King Charles are descended from. If you want to talk about Illuminati bloodlines, it doesn't get much bigger than these two. They would rejoin as the House of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha and reign over the British dynasty through King Edward VII in the first 7 years of his son King George V before he would change the name to the more British-sounding Windsor. While I called Duke Ernest II an ancestor to this line a minute ago, I wanted to clarify. He's really more of a relative, but the whole Illuminati bloodlines thing is a long and convoluted story in itself, and we will get into some of that here in just a little while. Before I get any further down the road on all of that, I want to touch on a few more points about the original Illuminati and Adam Weishaupt. After he fled to Gotha, he would continue to write on his ideals of Illuminism. The order itself was, at least officially, banned and its members dispersed. His beliefs would live on, however, and would go on to greatly influence many of America's founding fathers, including Thomas Jefferson, who would write in a letter to James Madison how he considered Weishaupt to be, quote, an enthusiastic philanthropist, who believed that the intention of Jesus Christ was to simply reinstate national religion and, by diffusing the light of his morality, to teach us to govern ourselves. While becoming the focal point of many conspiracy theorists when they talk about the Illuminati that secretly controls the world and has become a historical figure that so many love to hate, Weishaupt's intentions, originally at least, seem far less nefarious than they are often portrayed to be. A lot of what he wanted to spread, or at least that he wrote about, centered around virtue, philanthropy, social justice, and morality. The danger lies in the method of implementing these ideas by educating illuminated initiates and placing them in powerful positions through subversive and secretive means. While the original Illuminati is definitely fascinating, and I've had to compress and omit a lot for the sake of getting through all of this material, and we'll circle back to them more here in just a bit, but what it was and likely still is in a lot of ways is really benign in comparison to the truth of what really exists that most people now refer to as the Illuminati. We'll get there in a bit though. Weishaupt was an interesting character, and on the surface seems, although in opposition to the established order of the Catholic Church, to have had largely positive intentions, at least according to his originally stated goals. Even that, however, will vary wildly by who you ask and what you read. While he publicly spoke of freedom of religions and pushed for many of the ideals upon which America was supposedly founded, many will say that there are much darker intentions to his work and dealings in reality. Separating fact from fiction about him and the secret society that he founded is no easy task though. Trying to uncover the intentions and true purposes of any secret society is a complicated matter, simply by the very nature of it being a secret society. Speaking of which, let's get back on track just a bit and quickly discuss something I briefly touched on a moment ago, that being Weishaupt being initiated into the Masonic Lodge. Oh, and before I dive too far back into this, I just want to preface that this is something that I have a tiny bit of experience with, and if you want to hear that story, you're going to have to check out the BTR at the end of this series, because I've got enough to talk about throughout this series and definitely and just tonight itself, so I don't want to get totally sidetracked or add anything else to the mix at this point. It's not that big of a deal anyway, and I'm not trying to compel you to listen to the companion episode. I would just prefer to stay somewhat on track with this and save personal accounts and thoughts for the BTR as usual. Okay, so back to the story. The Freemasons, much like the Illuminati, claim to be rooted in the Enlightenment movement, but go back much, much further than that. Superficially, or at least publicly, they claim to trace their roots to the local guilds of stonemasons that started around the 14th century and were regulating the qualifications of stonemasons and their interactions with both authorities and clients, as well as organized and kept the trade secrets and techniques of stoneworking. If we peel back that top layer just a bit though, the first thing that we find is their supposed connection to the Knights Templar, and how they too served outwardly as a pious order, but behind closed doors were keepers of the ancient mysteries and likely served a very different agenda. Traces of this connection are evident within the lodges, and has become increasingly an open secret. There's actually an additional Masonic order, which bears their name in a form, and it's titled in full, the United Religious Military and Masonic Order of the Temple and of St. John of Jerusalem, Palestine, Rhodes, and Malta. But since that is a ridiculous mouthful of a name, it's typically just referred to as Knights Templar. Templar swords are also used ritualistically in the older and most powerful lodges, typically Grand Lodges. That being said, there is no real historical evidence to support this connection in any way. It's most likely entirely fabricated in an effort to give more historical prestige and credence to the order. Before I dig much further into the Masons, I need to make a quick distinction here. While they are either a nefarious organization of the powerful to influence global affairs, or simply a social club and fraternal order that focuses on philanthropy, will depend completely on who you ask. Most members actually don't know that much about what Masons truly do, at least not in the upper echelons. So in no way am I saying that your father, grandfather, uncle, or you, for that matter, are going to the local lodge to plot global domination or engage in satanic rites. Knowledge is sparsed out to the members slowly as they move up, and only according to what they need and seek to know. In this way, the vast majority of Freemasons are really good men, just wanting to be part of something and are largely unaware of the true history and deeper workings of the order. Now, back to the basics of Freemasons. Stoneworking guilds, possibly Knights Templar, most likely fabricated completely. But there is another history that comes directly from the pages of the earliest Masonic writings and manuscripts. The Hollowell manuscript, also known as the Regis poem from 1390 to 1425, the exact date is unknown on that, states that the craft of masonry began with Euclid in Egypt and came to England with the reign of King Athelstan in 924. Following texts such as the Matthew Cook manuscript would expand on this idea and push the date even further back into biblical times, to Jabal, the son of Lamech, and that the knowledge came to Euclid and from him to the children of Israel while they were still in Egypt. On June 24, 1717, the premier Grand Lodge of England was founded. James Anderson, a Scottish writer and minister, who was a Grand Warden at the Grand Lodge of England, which predated the Premier Lodge, was commissioned to write a unified history of the order in September 1721. In 1723, he would publish the Constitutions of the Freemason. While much of his work is questionable at best, it did serve to modernize the earlier Gothic constitutions into a definitive volume for an extended history, which also worked Euclid into the chain and continued the claims of its origin dating back to biblical times. The speculative histories would continue from there, with Sir Andrew Ramsay adding the Crusaders to the lineage, and maintained that the Crusader Masons had revived the craft with secrets recovered from the Holy Land under the patronage of the Knights Hospitallers. It was at this point that the liberal continental Freemasonry split from the Grand Lodge in England. When Ramsay introduced the Crusader Masons, the Knights Templar became a part of their myth. The murder of Hiram Abiff, who the Masons put forth as the key architect of Solomon's Temple, despite there being very little biblical evidence for this being the actual case, would become an allegorical tale and a key component of the third degree of Freemasonry, as well as commonly conflated as the first Master Mason. These English Masons would come to be known as the York Rite, and would maintain a focus on Christianity, at least publicly, with most of their ceremonies revolving around Solomon's Temple. And the Scottish Rite, despite the name, originated in France and later to America, where it truly flourished. It has definite roots in the Enlightenment, and a larger focus on politics, while the other main, let's say branch, for lack of a better term, is the Blue Lodge, which is simply the starting point of all Masons, and it focuses on initiating new members through the first 3 degrees of Entered Apprentice, Fellowcraft, and Master Mason. The Blue, or as it's more commonly called the Symbolic Lodge, is where Masons go to have all of their meetings. This entire episode, and honestly probably the rest of the season or more, could be made up entirely of just discussing the Freemasons. So I don't want to get too much further bogged down with just explaining what it all is in much more detail. Considering that simply by way of its secretive nature, it's impossible to really definitively say that anything about them is indisputable fact anyway. I would rather get back to their documented historical impact and how they most likely fit into the bigger picture of secret societies and tonight's episode as a whole. To help close the broad circle of tonight's opening, by 1779, the Order of the Illuminati had fully usurped and assumed leadership of the Masonic Lodge at Munich, thus marking the first joining of the Masons with the Illuminati. From there, they would rapidly grow to at least 2,500 members, many of whom came from the ranks of academia as he sought to wrestle control of education away from the church and establish order to better impress his ideas upon the younger generations, as well as the nobility, the government, diplomatic community, legal establishment, military, police forces, medical professions, the church, and other key institutions of society. Mutually fearing an educated and organized atheism, which was openly opposed to the church and governmental control, the Rosicrucians and others would call upon the Elector of Bavaria, Duke Karl Theodor, to ban the order, but with limited results at that time. That was until July 10, 1785, when a member of the order, a former Catholic priest, Johann Jacob Lang, or you'll also see it written L-A-N-Z as Land sometimes, died due to being struck by lightning while traveling to Silesia. He had stopped in Regensburg to meet with Weishaupt, but lightning met him first. He was then taken to the local chapel by a group of concerned onlookers, but he was already deceased. When the Bavarian authorities searched his body for personal effects, they would find the secret documents that would spell the beginning of the end for the Illuminati of Bavaria, including the names and locations of lodges, influential member names, length of time active, the manner in which it was operated, degrees of initiation, thoughts regarding the persecutions of the Freemasons and Illuminati in Bavaria, thoughts regarding the Jesuits and disciples of Loyola, and more. Weishaupt's second-in-command was a diplomat by the name of Xavier von Zwack, who had been one of Weishaupt's law students. In 1784, he had resigned from the Illuminati over Weishaupt's despotic control of the order. In 1786, another big blow to the order would come when his home would be raided by the Bavarian authorities, uncovering secret order documents in his possession, including the cipher of the Order of the Illuminati, the order's calendar, code names and locations, and lists of initiated members from 1776 through 1779. The Bavarian government would swiftly publish this document as some original works of the Order of the Illuminati, to show evidence of the order's aims to tear down religion and governments, and to rule the world as a secret society, which pulled the strings of members it helped to embed into positions of power. We spoke earlier about how this was around the time that the Illuminati was banned and its members scattered. While that is what officially happened, the truth of the matter is a bit more complex. During its primary existence, meaning from its founding in 1776 until its official banning by edict of the Bavarian government in 1785, the order managed to spread its influence first into Masonic lodges, often in positions of leadership, then throughout prominent houses of the time, government officials, clerics, and a long list of powerful people in positions of authority. It would also spread throughout not only Germany, but also Italy, Denmark, Russia, France, and America. The order's ideals, as well as the infusion of Kabbalism, mysticism, and occultism, were attractive to many of the time who were growing tired of the Catholic and Protestant suppression and domination, and was also assisted and propagated by several noted writers, poets, musicians, and artists of its day. In 1789, this would culminate in one of its first major events on the world stage, when cells of French Masonry and Illuminatists, which many Freemasons were, shall we say, Illuminized by this point, would, with the Duke of Orleans at the head, conspired to overthrow King Louis XVI and launch the first national revolution of modern times. While it is widely believed to have been initiated through an organic uprising of people over a lack of food and government representation, its true cause is much deeper than this. A Grand Master of the Masonic Grand Orient de France, the most powerful Masonic obedience in worldwide continental Freemasonry, Louis Philippe II, Duke of Orleans, would use his considerable wealth to buy up virtually all of the grain in France, and then either sold it abroad or hid it away in order to create near-starvation conditions among the commoners. Despite being first prince of the blood and a cousin of King Louis, he was a promoter of Illuminati and Enlightenment ideals, and a strong advocate of the elimination of the present absolute monarch in favor of a constitutional monarchy more in line with that of the British. He also funded and supported the revolutionaries, and was also a member of the Society of the Friends of the Constitution, a Jacobin, and was counted among the votes in favor of King Louis's execution on the 21st of January 1793. The French Revolution was the first time in recorded history that grievances would be systematically created in order to exploit them, but it certainly wouldn't be the last time. This technique, made famous by Hegel in his dialectic, would be used to manipulate public opinion and use it to manifest changes desired by the elites and in favor of their aims. I didn't touch on it because I felt it would be old hat, so to speak, to a lot of you guys, but the American brothers of these same individuals, only 4 years earlier, would help to both fund and facilitate the American Revolution, with high-ranking Master Mason George Washington as its leader. The Masonic lodges of the colonies played a major role in the Revolution. Many of America's founding fathers, including Benjamin Franklin, Samuel Adams, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, Richard Henry Lee, John Hancock, and several others, being openly proclaimed members. When Washington was later sworn into office as the first U.S. president, he did so on a Masonic Bible that was borrowed from St. John's Lodge No. 1, and while wearing his Masonic apron. When the U.S. Capitol's cornerstone was erected, he took the role of Grand Master Pro Tem in the Masonic ceremony. I could go on in regards to the influence of Freemasonry in America, and we'll probably at least touch on it again in this episode. But for now, let's shift back to the Illuminati for just a second. As I mentioned a moment ago, the Duc d'Orleans was not just the Grand Master of the Grand Orient, but Grand Master of all lodges in France, and was initiated into the Illuminati, along with the German Grand Master of Freemasons, who joined in 1783. A quick callback to episode 1 of this season, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, the author of Faust, who was also a notable member of the order. Two of Beethoven's music teachers, as well as his first publisher, were all Illuminatists, as was Mozart. Mozart's father was a Freemason, but said to detest the Illuminati. Fun fact, one of the primary symbols of the Illuminati, and one which graced both official documents as well as the floors of the lodges, is the pyramid, the same one you can see today by flipping over a $1 bill. Okay, I feel like at this point we've covered the reality of their original order fairly well, and established how it infiltrated other so-called secret societies and continued long after its official end. There's a lot more I could get into about both of these points, but there's also a ton of material I'm aiming to get through in these episodes. So in the interest of that, I'm going to pull back from the focal point of that and start looking at the interconnectedness of the picture, and eventually how it carries on to this day. Before I get into this next part though, now is a good time to make some distinctions about our subject matter. First of all, while the ideals, knowledge, symbolism, and other elements of the original order of the Illuminati carried on in many different forms and of varying extents through its original infiltration of Masonic lodges and spread like a plague throughout wealthy and powerful houses and their bloodlines, the order itself, at least as it once existed, is truly no more. So when people say that there was an Illuminati, but it only lasted a few years until it was banned, they're technically correct, I guess. The people and organizations we will cover throughout this series don't all come together in darkened chambers still and meet under that name. and total intentions of the Illuminati. In fact, the original order had much more benevolent intentions, at least outwardly, than the monolithic force which currently opposes us today. Despite infiltrating a vast section of influential positions in their day, they were also far less successful and infinitely less powerful. They go by many names, as you will soon hear, from the global elite down to the shadow governments that do their biddings. A lot of what you will hear will be difficult for a lot of people to believe. There are a lot of pieces to this massive puzzle, and attempting to put them together in a cogent manner, free from unfounded speculation, mis and disinformation, and crossing the line into simply unprovable and largely unhinged conspiracy theory, has been no small task. And this series is truly the culmination of 24 years worth of research, writing, and carefully sifting through an unimaginable volume of documents to find what I needed, and to sort facts from a vast ocean of fiction. I don't even expect you to fully believe everything I have to say, only to listen with an open mind, hopefully, and know that none of this is just fabrication or things that I've said simply for the fact of connecting dots or drawing parallels where none actually existed. Now, with that out of the way, let's dig a bit deeper into this story and take a look at some of the major players in the cabal of global elites, who they are, as well as how certain bloodlines have remained in power throughout the history of the world for centuries. Part 1. It runs in the family. Before we jump back in our DeLorean and dig into how this actually started, let's talk briefly about a more familiar topic for my American listeners, and that being the U.S. presidents. Presidents, the king of the modern era, while they have far less actual power than a monarchy, or, as we will soon discuss, far less power than we are even told that they have, a key element of controlling any country lies in having a leader, or figurehead at least, that is either sympathetic to your cause or at very least compromised enough to play the game. Before we get into how deep these genealogical connections really go, let's look at the surface of this iceberg and just brush up on the commonly known information. The immediate family ties are, of course, the father-son pairs of John Quincy Adams, our 6th president, and his father, John Adams, our 2nd. And who could forget, of course, George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush, 41 and 43 respectively. We have one grandfather and grandson pair in our 9th, William Henry Harrison, who, by the way, has the distinction of having the shortest time in office, as he was only president for 1 month before his death, and his grandson, our 23rd president, Benjamin Harris. For those who dig a little deeper down, a common thing you might have heard was how FDR, the 32nd president, was related to not only Theodore Roosevelt, the 26th president, but speaking of keeping it in the family here, his wife Eleanor was also Theodore's niece. However, Franklin Roosevelt was also fairly closely related to John Adams, our 2nd president, Ulysses S. Grant, our 18th president, as well as being easily related to at least a minimum of 9 others. And that's without even doing much looking into his lineage. One you probably heard more recently and slightly less expectedly was number 44, Barack Obama, is actually a somewhat distant cousin of his predecessor, George W. Bush. Number 36, Lyndon Johnson, and number 33, Harry S. Truman. If we step slightly further back though, and start to peek below the waterline a little of this iceberg, we find that on the father's side only, mind you, at least 5 U.S. presidents, including our first, George Washington, John Adams, John Quincy Adams, Franklin Roosevelt, and Theodore Roosevelt, are all direct descendants of English King Edward I of England, Hammer of the Scots. If we look a little deeper and truly take in the full picture, however, by tracing their lineage not only along paternal lines, but also maternally, a very different and much stranger picture starts to emerge. With the exception of our 8th president, Martin Van Buren, at least not along this line anyway, every single U.S. president can be traced back to Robin Hood's arch nemesis and signer of the Magna Carta himself, King John of England. This was actually discovered by a 7th grader named Bridget d'Avion from Salinas, California, with the help of her amateur genealogist, 80-year-old grandfather, who had been helping people trace their family roots for at least 6 decades. This was widely reported on at the time, and then the media did an immediate about-face and reverted back to the previous genealogical approach of looking only at the paternal connections in order to, insert air quotes here, debunk her findings before burying the story altogether. The only traces that I found in a recent search were write-ups done in UK newspapers and websites that were based outside of the US. As easy as this is to dismiss with the good old, well, everyone is related if you go back far enough line, it begins to paint a bigger picture of how certain family bloodlines are interconnected and have maintained power throughout history. Speaking of bloodlines, I suppose I can't dance around this much longer. If we're going to bring this story into the modern day and attempt to make sense of all of this in a meaningful way somewhat, then we're going to have to talk about it. So you want to know who actually runs the world? The people behind the scenes who really hold the puppet strings of those in power? Well, to figure that out, we first have to take a look at the families who control the majority of the world's wealth and hold influence over everything else we will come to talk about throughout this entire series. Some of these names will be familiar, some not so much. Some are lower on the pyramid than others, but all are important. I'll give you the name, then a bit of context, and we will dig even deeper on a few of them in a bit. While this order is debatable, the top 2 can't be so easily disputed. Starting with number 13, the Astor bloodline. While not a name that many will be familiar with in this day, they left an indelible mark on the social, governmental, and financial landscapes of both Britain and America. For over a century, they were the wealthiest family in America, and through shrewd marriages managed to link themselves to several of the most politically powerful families. Johann, as was his original name, better known as John Jacob Astor I, immigrated to America in 1783 from humble German roots and using the voyage to learn all that he could about the fur trade. Around 1800, after successfully establishing a vicious monopoly in the fur trade, he had amassed over $250,000. He grew that fortune further in the opium trade with China. Good old friend to the Illuminati and Adam Weishaupt, Thomas Jefferson, would grant Astor permission to establish the American Fur Company on April 6 of 1808, establishing an even greater monopoly that he would continue to expand until he became America's first millionaire. Throughout this time, Astor was buying up land all around New York, particularly in Manhattan, which he correctly predicted would soon boom, and eventually sold all of his fur companies to further grow his fortune in the real estate market in that area. While the Astor family had a very dubious rise and eventual fall, that is a whole episode in itself to try and cover. At the time of John's death, he had amassed an estimated fortune of at least $20 million, equivalent to $598 million today, or $398 million more than Jeff Bezos in 2020. Many buildings around New York still bear his name, and he was a high-ranking Freemason serving as Grand Treasurer of the Grand Lodge in New York and Master of the Holland Lodge, number 8. Number 12. The Bundy bloodline. While I personally question this one, and all the research I've done into them fails to corroborate the writings of Fritz Springmeier. By the way, he was the author originally responsible for tracing and laying out these names like way back in the 90s. McGeorge Bundy, who served as National Security Advisor to JFK and later to Johnson, and his brother, William Bundy, who was an attorney as well as intel expert within the CIA, were both members of Skull and Bones. Don't worry, we'll get into them soon enough. And held gatekeeper-like positions controlling what info the president did and didn't receive, as well as being influential in U.S. policy decisions such as escalating the U.S. involvement in Vietnam. I still don't really see that their bloodline was all that important. though several other family members have ties to Skull and Bones as well, and were involved heavily in politics. Number 11. The Collins bloodline. There's no historical evidence of this family's origin either, but supposedly there are said to be high-level witches and Satanism tied to the modern Illuminati, particularly the grandmother of the Collins, not grandmother, grand space mother of the Collins, who was accused of sacrificing children to fuel the establishment of the New World Order. That, in my opinion, tips a little too far into the hooey level stuff, if you ask me, but there are plenty who deeply believe in all of that, including many of the people in high positions, so I guess it doesn't really matter what I think, so long as that's what they believe. Number 10. The DuPont bloodline. Now we get into a fun one. This family traces its lineage back to Samuel DuPont and Anne Alexandrine Montechanin. Anne was a known occult practitioner and medium. Their son, Pierre Samuel, denies ever learning any of these arts from her, but was suspected of it. Pierre is considered an eminent French writer, economist, and government official. He also deeply involved in the French Illuminatism and the French Revolution, and was president of the National Constituent Assembly before he fled during the Revolution and immigrated to America, where his son started the largest gunpowder manufacturing corporation in America, DuPont de Nemours and Company, which he grew into the largest black powder manufacturer in the world at that time. The family would carry on the ancient elite's practice of marrying within the bloodline for purity, and would go on to become a close friend of Thomas Jefferson. Are we seeing a pattern with him yet? Which would help facilitate the DuPont's first major black powder sale and assist Pierre Samuel in becoming a diplomat to France during the reign of Napoleon. Pierre would also be the mind originally behind the Louisiana Purchase. You may know his son's company better as simply DuPont, as it's known today, which owns a variety of top-level companies involved with manufacturing, agriculture, chemicals, electronics, medical care, and much more. Number 9. The Freeman bloodline. Like many of the lesser-known bloodlines who have chosen to remain largely unseen and working behind closed doors, very little is actually known about these guys, aside from them originating from England and having links to several secret societies, including Skull and Bones and several prominent members in the world of science, law, and business. Number 8. The Kennedy bloodline. Of Irish descent and commonly called America's royal family, they worked behind the scenes for years before JFK shot the family to power and prominence as president, with JFK's father believed to have had mafia ties and a known member of the Pilgrim Society, which is a quasi-secret society between Britain and America. JFK was also related closely to Anton LaVey, the founder of the Satanic Church, and was linked romantically with several of its members such as Jane Mansfield and Marilyn Monroe. While JFK was once a president that I greatly admired, and still feel was one of the last, if not the last, truly democratically elected presidents, which that's a theory we can save for a later time, his reputation has been dampened in recent years as more and more has leaked out regarding his personal life. The family remains politically involved to this day, with RFK's son currently attempting to run for president himself. They are also connected to several big names in the media and Hollywood. Number 7. The Lee bloodline. Lee, spelled L-I, are believed to have made much of their fortune in the opium trade as well, though most of their history and current activities remain shrouded in mystery. They do, however, have a long-running association with the Rockefeller family. Number 6. The Onassis bloodline. From Greek descent, owns a controlling stake in approximately 95 multinational businesses on 5 different continents, linked into the Kennedy bloodline through JFK's widow, Jacqueline, and they're known as the Golden Greeks. I don't know that much about the Onassis, and I don't put a ton of stock in them having any sort of nefarious Illuminati connections necessarily, but they're on the list, so we gotta cover them. And as much as I would love to cover the rest of these bloodlines right now, especially since most of the crazy connections and most powerful families and all the good stuff is still yet to come. And we will have to wait until next week to get into those. I realize this is a short episode to start us off and probably feels more like a teaser than anything, but there is good reason for that. While researching this episode, I came across so much more information than I had ever anticipated and managed to debunk several things that I wanted to cover to start with. While this is a puzzle that I've been piecing together for a very long time now, there is an unimaginable number of layers to all of this, and I wanted to make it as accurate and definitive as I possibly could. In order to do that, I've had to sort through more hours worth of research than I ever imagined, and mere fact-checking of what I've already covered just tonight was a difficult and extremely long process. Condensing all of this research into something halfway interesting and remotely cohesive, and then writing it out for these episodes has been a whole other lengthy and arduous process. Sure, I could have just rehashed theories and threw it all together without checking anything, like some people do. And it would have been a longer first episode, maybe even just one big long episode. But it wouldn't tie it all together at the end, and it wouldn't be up to the standard of what I attempt to do in these episodes. So, I apologize for this somewhat brief intro into this incredibly massive topic, but hopefully we have laid the groundwork at least for something you will actually get something out of at the end. And hopefully you will bear with me and come back next week for part 2 of this series, where we will finish up the bloodlines, including the 2 biggest and most powerful families of the modern age, as well as identify the old world ruling elite, and then begin to lay out the organizations that have carried on in service of a global government agenda for centuries. Learn just how twisted some of these people actually are, see just how far the world's oldest and biggest conspiracy theory reaches, and eventually, just how deep this rabbit hole actually goes. Trust me when I say, we are only getting started. And the best is absolutely yet to come. From the bottom up to the very top of the pyramid, we are about to, for the first time, that I'm aware of at least, accurately and definitively fully expose the entire cabal. From banking to entertainment to politics, before I'm finished, you will finally be shown the full uncensored picture of it all. Oh, and all of my research is fully backed up, encrypted, and set on a dead man switch, just for the record. I'm also not remotely suicidal, or a drug user, and in good health, just in case. Thank you guys all for joining me this evening. Please don't forget to follow the show on Spotify if you can. It really does help. It's absolutely free, and it's sincerely appreciated. Hit me up in the Q&A if you have any questions, or if there's anything that you would like to contribute to this series, and I will address any of those in the eventual BTR that I'll be doing for all of this. And as always, I'll keep your name and all your info private, so there's no reason to fear what you write there. If you don't hear from me next week, then I love you all, and it's been a hell of a ride. Hopefully, though, I'll talk to you all again real soon on the next Clandestine Radio.